All right, everyone. Well, we are getting to the culminating keynote and final performance. I want to remind you that after we hear this wonderful keynote from Glenn Singleton, we will finish the day with a performance by the Atlantic writer, the poet, the scholar, Clint Smith. And so please make sure that you don't miss what promises to be an incredible final act for an incredible day. And with that, I am extremely excited to introduce Glenn E. Singleton, who will provide our closing keynote this evening. I can't think of a more fitting end to our convening's discussion, as Glenn's work cuts across the private sector, across education, government, and nonprofits. Glenn has devoted over 30 years to advancing racial equity, working with a range of practitioners, leaders, and organizations as president of the organization he founded, Pacific Educational Group. His book, Courageous Conversations About Race, and the accompanying Courageous Conversations protocols are known in the field as key tools to promote a framework of racial equity. The training Beyond Diversity, which he developed, has supported hundreds of thousands of people in deepening their own practice for pursuit of racial justice. And certainly, as you can tell by the theme of today's conversation, we ourselves are influenced by Glenn's work. What is critical about the tools, training, and coaching that Glenn has developed are their impact on personal and organizational practice. They work to keep conversations and work on racial equity, equitable, and cultivating a lasting impact for change. In a recent New York Times feature on his work, Glenn emphasized the ways that white supremacy culture operates in schools and offices, including the myth of meritocracy and valuing written conversation over other forms, which lead to denigration of black children in school. Although another hallmark is scientific linear thinking, cause and effect. He noted one of the challenges in the diversity, equity, inclusion space is that folks keep asking for data. I hear this a lot myself. How do you quantify in a way that is scientific? Numbers and that kind of thing. What people feel when they're feeling marginalized. In other words, it's just because you can't measure it doesn't mean it isn't real. And in fact, what we measure are themselves a product of power and politics. In the private sector, Glenn has consulted with executives at Wieden and Kennedy, advertising, Google, Amazon, Procter & Gamble, to name a few. Along with Wieden and Kennedy, he received the 2017 Valuable Partnership Award by AdColor, and most recently on his own was awarded the Adweek AdColor 2020 Champion Award. Glenn's pioneering work on Courageous Conversations has traveled the globe and includes establishing the Courageous Conversations South Pacific Institute in Auckland, New Zealand. For 8 years, he served as an adjunct professor of educational leadership at San Jose State University. Glenn has been a guest lecturer at Harvard University and has instructed at University of Minnesota, NYU School of Medicine, and the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin. Please join me in welcoming Glenn Singleton to Truth and Transformation 2020.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. It is such a pleasure to be here to end the week out. Man, it's so much going on. And so I have such a brief period of time with you. So let me just start with just a whole bunch of gratitude and extending that first and foremost to the Lumbee, the Piscataway, the Cherokee people who are the original custodians of the land here where I am, my hometown of Baltimore. After 30 years in the West, pandemic brought me home. And so I'm most thankful to the guidance of the most benevolent ancestors, the elders, the highest power, of course, and everybody who has just made it possible. And you'll notice right away that I am harking back. And I think that part of the strategy of success in the equity, diversity, and inclusion space is recognizing that we're living about 3 different time periods. And one is the past, one is the present, and one is the future. And so the ability to be able to navigate all of those is critical. These Yoruba women who are representing this ancient wisdom, if you will, from West Africa, is indicating to me that so much of what I am actually experiencing here has to do with what the ancestors have told me and the experiences that I've had. In fact, it's those experiences that have shaped my beliefs about racial justice, about racial equity, and those beliefs are what fashion into my behavior And those behaviors are precisely what yield the results for me. And so when I think about that, and I just do a bit of a scan, and I urge you to do this with me, because ultimately we're talking about what works and what we know does not work. And if we're talking truth to this, we've got to get to the first part of this, which is consciousness is essential. We've got to know some things. And so what our life has brought us, I started out in Baltimore City here. I attended Baltimore City Public School from K to 6. And then at 6th grade, my family whisked me off into an independent school, a school founded because so many of the independent schools in Baltimore were not admitting all students. And these all students at this point were Jewish students. And so Park School was founded non-sectarian, but with the intention of opening its doors to Jewish students in Baltimore. My family believed that that would be a suitable environment because those same independent schools were not admitting students of color much. And so Brown versus Board of Education changed so much of the public school landscape, and so many folks, white people in the United States, rushed into independent school education for fear of school desegregation. And so in the midst of that, there are some progressive independent schools, mine being one of them, that welcomed me in. So what I would do is I would boast right away of an experience of some of the most prestigious education in the United States. I studied at the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. So that's where I began looking into media, the impact of media, advertising, specifically on children and the development. On from there, I went into my first career in advertising and experienced a industry that was approaching 100 years old at the point. I was in the very first advertising agency in the country. I found that this was a coveted job, working in New York City in 1986, earning $10,400. So it wasn't working out for me. I was paying more, or getting paid less, than I had paid the previous year in student loans. And so I needed to really find, well, what is the value of this? Well, I kind of lasted for that for a while and went back to the university, ultimately became the director of admission for the Western region. Penn moved me out to California and opened my eyes to a brand new experience. I had been used to being in places like Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, where I'm so used to seeing my image and so used to seeing my image all over the place. Whereas when I got to California, Los Angeles particularly, I saw lots of people of color, but they weren't my image. And so the first thing I noticed was that I was on a tremendous growth spurt there. I had to be curious about what was going on because I did not know the lay of the land. I went on to graduate school at Stanford. It was touted as the top graduate school of education at that point. How does the top graduate school of education not have any faculty members who look like me? And so this was a question. I complemented my study with some field work in a local high school. And there's where I was awakened. My consciousness shifted because I saw in K-12 education, different than director of admission, how education was different for students who looked like me versus students who were white in the United States. And I also learned that these are not conversations that we have. And so as I would call out the obvious, why are the Black children sitting in the back of the school? Why are their teachers the ones who tend not to have as much experience? Why is it that there's less enthusiasm about their curriculum? Why is it that no one believes that these kids are going to go on to college? And I was asking these questions, and I thought, these are pretty basic questions, but I found out that there was just this resistance, this pushback. Later, I would call this courageous conversation. And it was courageous because these are the conversations that you were just not supposed to be having. And so as I move forward and I think about, where I was standing in my youth, and I'm 56 years old now, and as the introduction said, I have 30 years in this game, I would say then that I'm sitting now in this place of understanding that the very first thing we have to do is we have to recognize that absent courage, there is no transformation. And so what I hope is that if I start with what success looks like, because that was the leading question for this particular gathering, what's getting in the way of D&I being successful? And when it is successful, what does it look like? Let me start with what it looks like.
If people say your dreams are crazy, if they laugh at what you think you can do, good. Stay that way. Because what non-believers fail to understand is that calling a dream crazy is not an insult. It's a compliment. Don't try to be the fastest runner in your school or the fastest in the world. Be the fastest ever. Don't picture yourself wearing OBJ's jersey. Picture OBJ wearing yours. Don't settle for homecoming queen or linebacker. Do both. Lose 120 pounds and become an Ironman after beating a brain tumor. Don't believe you have to be like anybody to be somebody. If you're born a refugee, don't let it stop you from playing soccer for the national team at age 16. Don't become the best basketball player on the planet. Be bigger than basketball. Believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. When they talk about the greatest team in the history of the sport, make sure it's your team. If you have only one hand, don't just watch football, play it at the highest level. And if you're a girl from Compton, don't just become a tennis player. Become the greatest athlete ever. Yeah, that's more like it. So don't ask if your dreams are crazy. Ask if they're crazy enough.
Now I'm going to get to why this is the indication of success, okay, and what goes into it. But I just want to say that part of what this means for me is my study in media and my movement into advertising as the first career, and my circle back to working in the advertising industry primarily in this equity, diversity, and inclusion space modified by race is the idea that if we change what's going on in advertising, and advertising being one of the most influential socializing factors in children and adults, then in fact we can transform how we start to see these issues of race in our society and how we start to address racial inequity. My second career is in education, and I do believe that the education of children at this point and growing up a new society with very different beliefs through different experiences in school is going to shift the way society arrives at these outcomes. And so if we can change how children learn, and we can change what they learn about themselves and others as it relates to race, then in fact we can make a difference. And so my work with Portland Public Schools and with Wieden & Kennedy Advertising are the case studies of success. And I'm also showing Portland Public Schools because this also shows what becomes the problem and why these efforts don't succeed in the long term. And so some data that you're just seeing really quickly is what happened after sustained effort. And I'm going to speak to what that effort is. Okay, but the data is very good, and you can trust me because I'm going to go really fast. But this is data that is unprecedented. It's data that we're not seeing across the pre-K-12 space at this time. And my basic idea here is that we can eliminate racial achievement disparity, and there are a variety of ways that we're going to do it. And one of the ways that we have to do is have honest conversations about what's happening to children of color, and schools never designed to educate them in the first place. And so as we keep moving on and we look at this data, we start to see in all of the measurable markings, standardized testing to graduation rates, you see this achievement. So how is this happening? And keep in mind that the story doesn't end well here. So I'm building you up to let you know that a key part of this is how we talk about scalability and how we talk about sustainability. It's nothing to do this just for one period of time, one set of leaders. You've got to actually institutionalize something. And I'm going to speak to what that something is. And so as we're able to move to a system of schools that are producing these kinds of outcomes, you would think that everyone in the nation would be eager to be studying what was going on in Portland Public Schools at this period. And so these markers are exceptional markers, and they have a lot to do with who the educators are there. And so we run into a system where the children are increasingly students of color and the educators are increasingly white. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean that white educators can't teach students of color, but it does mean that students of color do need to see their image reflected in the instructor and in the curriculum and in the instructional practice. Just like in the advertising world, we want to see commercials on TV that represent our authentic experience. And in order for that to happen, you need to have people in the agency who actually reflect those experiences, bring those beliefs, behave in the ways that actually create some design, some creative effort that allows us to see what you just saw in the groundbreaking Colin Kaepernick ad for Nike. And so now we look at Portland Public Schools at the end of the beginning of 2019. Our work ends somewhere around the end of 2017. And you start to see it as a system that is doing as poorly as any other system in the state. And because it's the largest of the systems, this is most detrimental. But the very teachers that we brought, the very administrators that we brought, were no longer sticking around. So what do I believe is critical here? And what do I believe led to that success? Three things. One, we've got to be aware, and we've got to know what race is, and we've got to know how race impacts our experiences. Two, we've got to be self-aware. Okay? And so if consciousness is race in general and how race plays out in the organization, self-awareness is really about knowing how race plays out in my life, and empathy. And many people talk about the lack of this in the human experience right now. This is a very hard and cold country. We have accepted a whole lot of ways about being as human beings towards each other that's simply not acceptable. And ultimately, if you can't point to adults who are at the highest levels in our country and our government and say, this is what I want my child to be like, then we've got a problem. And we need to name that. Courageous conversation is speaking truth to power. And it's making sure that we don't simply sit back and allow for these things to occur. These things as achievement problems in school, blamed on kids and families. These things in advertising, where we have an industry that continues to not welcome people of color. And those people of color who are there remain at the lowest levels of the organization until they get exhausted of that menial experience and they just leave. And so consciousness means that we open our eyes to what's going on. We open our eyes and we see that there are aspects of race that are happening each and every day. I just want to show you a bit of a consciousness experience that's just connected to my short life. 5 decades of consciousness here. So these were things that just drew my attention on my timeline. From about 6 or 7 years old, I was talking about race to my family already. I was having a courageous conversation to just right now. And so when I developed this idea of what is courageous conversation, I wanted folks to recognize that too often we had signaled what is the problem. And we had already signaled why it is that we should take care of the problem. But what was missing is how to go about it. How to go about it was the real tool that I heard educators need, that I heard advertisers need, and now I hear all across the globe and all across the different sectors. People need to know how to have these conversations. And we try to skip over the conversation because we don't know how to have it and try to get into more technical experiences of work. But we can't actually repair something that we can't talk about. And so skipping over the conversation and all of the challenges that it occurs, we needed to make some agreements, some very quick agreements about how we do this. And so the agreements were that we essentially bring our whole selves to the conversation, that we allow for the discomfort, that we share what's true, a theme of this conference, this gathering that we're here, and that we recognize that we inherited this challenge and it's going to be here tomorrow. And so we work as if we know that there's something else to do the next day. My grandmother used to say, you might not fix it, but you better die trying. And so this non-closure aspect is what doesn't stop us in our tracks because the problem is so big. We search for improvement. And so there were parts to just explaining how it is that we talk about race. We also wanted to show folks that there was an ability to hold this race conversation in multiple aspects of our being. So we named this the Courageous Conversation Compass. And the compass is this allowance, this way of not only experiencing race in the primary sense, as I grew up and was socialized in the emotional quadrant, but it's also experiencing race in the intellect. It's experiencing race in the values aspect, your morality. It's experiencing race in your relational or your moral, your doing aspect, or the acting, as we call it. And too often I was discovering that I was in deep feeling about these issues, about George Floyd, about Breonna Taylor. And I was having conversations with people who didn't have those feelings. They were connected to the conversation, but it was an intellectual process and there was a miss. And so I knew that we needed to come up with real precise ways to talk about race. We needed to start this conversation at the deeply personal space where each and every person figured out the impact of race in their lives. We had to recognize that that impact is 100% for all of us, always going on. And then from there, we can understand what consciousness is. But if we don't recognize that it's always there, and it's always there for all of us, regardless of our race, it's always there, then we can't get to a high level of consciousness. And so what was it like then to expose people to their own racial narrative? And that's what teachers needed. That's what school leaders needed. That's what advertising executives needed. That's what the creative forces in advertising needed. They needed to understand, how is race coming through me? And what is my own racial experience? We give them an exercise where they figure out when they were initiated into the racialized society. And that's that first moment where you're actually your own compass, if you will. You have your own feelings, your own thinking, your own beliefs, your own acting, right? Not something inherited. Lots was going on in the world before I became racially conscious. Even the Tuskegee experiment, which has an impact today on whether I do that virus vaccine for COVID-19. Yes, I have that legacy effect, that distrust of medicine, if you will, that I've inherited. But that wasn't my earliest moment, even though I was born during the end of that experience. My earliest moment hits on my own timeline in 1976. My earliest moment is when I leave an all-Black elementary school in Baltimore, where I'm one of the children, okay, one of just everyone there. And overnight, not overnight, a couple months later, I'm in a predominantly white school where it's just me and Jimmy, two best friends from the same apartment complex. Why is it here that Mrs. Thomas could recognize every single one of us and know our names and know our family names? But here, Jimmy and I were confused every single day. Why is it that Jimmy and I never got to be in the same classroom, even though we were taking the same courses? Because the racial consciousness and the self-awareness of the educators was so low that the decisions they made out of great intention were still not the best decisions. They also didn't recognize, as Du Bois pointed out in 1903, that there's a color line. There's a relation between the darker and lighter races. In America, Asia, the islands of the sea. And he hearkened back to the Civil War at the turn of the century and said, you know, curious it was to how this deeper question of the color line ever forced itself to the surface despite effort and disclaimer. Well, that's what we're doing right now. And so this modern piece of Race in My Life, the timeline from 7th grade right on up to the current, right on up to today, what a color line we see. And what a whole different experience we have just had in the past 4 years. Well, Barack Obama wrote about that. And unfortunately, as a president who understood how race played out, a president who attempted to bring Skip Gates to the Rose Garden to explain why we can't have police racially profiling, Barack Obama wrote about that in Dreams from His Father. Barack Obama studied with Derek Bell. Barack Obama was a student of critical race theory. And at the same time, this is now the idea that is subject of an executive order being transposed from that which heightens our racial consciousness in this country to perhaps trying to name it as racist in and of itself. Well, we need critical race theory. We need racial consciousness. We need self-awareness to understand why there's racial disparity in the pandemic, why it is that it takes so much in terms of the destruction of Black lives in order for white America to wake up and recognize that there still exists a color line. And sometimes it gets quite confusing because some of the actors are sometimes people of color themselves. And not knowing which side you need to be on for racial justice, this becomes quite a problem. And so what I offer is, in order to deal with this effectively, what has worked is first to move away from what I call random acts of equity. These are just random programs that in and of themselves look great for Black History Month or Hispanic Heritage Month or, you know, for whatever the month may be, to really looking at this systemically. And in the systemic aspect, dealing with, as Asa Hilliard said, the knowledge, skill, will, and capacity to transform. And so as we're looking at that, and as we're coming to understand this in a systemic structure, we also have to phase in the work that we're doing. This is a long-term effort. This is not a one and done. This is not about bringing in an unconscious bias seminar. This is really about paying attention at the first phase to building the people internally so that they have their own personal sense of race and how race impacts their lives. At the second phase, we begin to look at how people bring that insight, that awareness, that consciousness, if you will, into the work that they do, into the work and get practice being able to do that. So in the advertising agency, after they are trained, after they are brought into their awareness, and there's an investment there, and it happens from the top to the bottom, each and every employee has to discover how then I bring that awareness into the work that I do. And they need practice time to do that. Only then can they look outside of the organization to the work that they put out into the world. What we saw after George Floyd is we saw many, many companies put out statements of how they supported Black Lives Matter and policy this and policy that. But what you noticed is a groundswell in the organization, particularly of employees of color, who recognized that there was a disconnect between what was professed and what was practiced. That means that the organization was trying to go to phase 3 before they actually did phase 1 and phase 2. And so when I bring this back to that first commercial that I showed you, how Nike got to Colin Kaepernick through Wieden and Kennedy Advertising, our partner for 4 years up to that point. Wieden took the Courageous Conversation protocol, the agreements, the conditions, and the compass, and factored it into their own language in phase 2. And in phase two, it was about creating a new climate, a new culture in the organization where discomfort is the norm. And everyone came to share their story. Only then do they get practice in what that story is going to look like when they start doing work. You got to stop hiring yourself, and we got to cut down on the processes that predict that we're going to going to the same schools, using the same kind of criteria, which always yields the same people with the same experiences coming into the organization. What does belonging mean? Ask the people who don't feel a sense of belonging what it is they need to bring their whole selves to work. And where is the space for those who show up, who have so much to say, but don't know how to find their voice or find their way in with their voice? Well, this became an award-winning experience in the top agency in the globe. And not only the Colin Kaepernick ad, but my litmus test is when people of color actually begin to benefit from the racial equity, diversity, and inclusion work. If this is only about creating greater leadership of those who are leading right now, then we haven't done our job. Because basically then we are just reifying the system with greater skills and capacity to stay racially stratified. That means the top will continue to be white, and people of color will find their place in the bottom. I want to show you Curvin's work as I sign off with you, because this is of a Black creative of that same advertising agency, and what happens when you start becoming truthful in the advertising space. The same as what happens when educators start becoming truthful in the K-12 space. And so Curvin's was given the brief. This is for the 2018 Winter Olympics. It's no secret to people of color that the Winter Olympics are not the most belonging or inclusive place for people of color. We all have that funny joke of the Jamaican bobsled team. In fact, they made a movie about it. But by and large, if you want to see people of color, you got to wait for the summer. Well, Curvin's took that as a project, and he took that as, what if we start changing that mindset? It's not that people of color can't do these things, but the Olympics have to become a bit more inclusive. And what is my job as a creator? To change that image and to tell the true story. Well, here we go.
Ooh, child, things are gonna get easier. Ooh, child, things will get brighter. Ooh, child, things are gonna get easier. Ooh, child, things will get brighter. Someday we'll get it together and we'll get it all done. Someday when your head is much lighter. Someday we'll walk in the rays of a beautiful sun. Someday when the world is much brighter. Oh, child, things are gonna get easier. Things will get easier.
I end with the wisdom of our ancestor, Dr. Maya Angelou, who told us about courage. And she said, without courage, you can't practice any other virtue consistently. You can practice any virtue erratically, but nothing consistently without courage. So when it works, it's systemic. When it works, it's about consciousness. When it works, it's about self-awareness. When it works, it's about empathy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Glenn. We are so appreciative for your talk and just hearing your incredible words of wisdom with the keynote address that you've provided. I just want to mention that we've heard in detail about the protocol and speaking your truth. And I'm personally so grateful for your work and specifically the Courageous Conversations About Race Summit space, which has been imperative in my own personal and professional development of my racial justice pedagogy, and has been one of the most profoundly accountable spaces I have been in as a white person and racial equity practitioner. So the summit continues to be, even if we might not meet in person this year, but virtually one of the most incredible spaces for this deep personal truth and reckoning work that is so much a part of our conference today and what you've shared with us.
Thanks,
So thank you.
Frank, it's so good to see you again.
Yeah, it's great to see you. So the audience has been buzzing, and I'm so excited to dive into some of the comments and questions that we've collected. Particularly on this note of the interaction between data and narrative. And it was just so beautiful how you oscillated between the two in your own personal life. Again, this infusion of personal narrative with holding up the mirror for ourselves and our organizations. Can you speak a little bit more about that interaction, both in the protocol and trainings that you've developed, but also in your work consulting and coaching organizations?
Well, they're both so important, right? And I had this education from the University of Pennsylvania, founded by Ben Franklin. He talked about matters that are ornamental and matters that are practical, and the full life being a combination of those. And I just see that there are some aspects of this personal narrative that are both practical and ornamental. The beauty of a story, but also the recognition that at many important times, people of color, our stories weren't worth quantifying. They weren't worth researching. And so too often we're being asked to give a quantifiable result for something that organizations, schools have never even chosen to acknowledge versus measure. And so if I go into a company or to a school and I ask, how racist are you right now? Right? Let's quantify that. I won't have a job much longer. Okay, so I never get a baseline. So I have to actually start in a place of narrative and story and let people start talking about who they are and what their experience is. And then we can start measuring. Right? We can start making sense of that, and we'll set that as the baseline. And then we'll go a little bit further. But sometimes the entry point has been, we want to do an assessment. We want to, have the data point. We want to know what the KPI is, the ROI is, all of that. So I'm like, hold on. We're not even acknowledging what the problem is. We haven't learned how to talk about it yet. So let's humanize this a bit. We don't start out in numbers. We start out in language and words.
Absolutely. And something I just appreciate so much also in the agreements is this idea of accepting and expecting non-closure.
Absolutely.
Right. So we're not going to solve everything in one meeting or one training, but that steady, engaged, accountable work together and collaboratively.
And that brings us back together each time. I mean, sometimes these events are so traumatic and so awful. And at the same time, because of the trauma and because of how awful it is, the triumph, when we go to get that award for that commercial, or when, Carol Smith, who was superintendent of Portland Public Schools, gets recognized as a state leader in these issues, that joy that comes is nothing like we've had before either. And so if we can just hold out sometimes and keep going, knowing that it's not finished, but knowing that we're making progress and really celebrating that progress and celebrating each other in that journey of progress, so essential.
Absolutely. One of the things that Dr. Muhammad spoke about earlier today was the incredible number of statements that we've seen from both companies and nonprofits and the like around racial justice and Black Lives Matter this summer. One question that's come up is, do you think that many of the organizations that have made these external statements of support for racial equity and justice are they looking within and addressing these issues in their own organizations? So both, do the statements hold up to the work internally, and also what do you think can drive them to do this?
Well, I mean, clearly there are far more organizations who have made statements who are nowhere near those statements in terms of what the work life is like in the organization. And there are some organizations that are in progress, but still their statement is a bit aspirational. And for our clients and partners, what I recommended was we not make those statements. We not make those projections outward. We actually use that time to make statements internally of what are our commitments given this new arena that we're in. Okay, because too often, as I was talking about the phase 3 of showing the world who we are, okay, we often try to show the world who we are before figuring out who we are. Okay, and then we double down on a problem essentially because the inauthenticity that we experience from the outside world plus the inauthenticity that we experience on the inside world make this all the more challenging for us. And so I think it's the full gamut of them. And clearly, given that you don't see many organizations really taking the lead in a public space and offering to us here, this is how we deal with racial injustice. This is how we eliminate the racial disparities. This is how we have 13% Black folks at the top levels. You don't see much of that. And so you see so many more statements than you see actual practice and results.
Right. Absolutely. And I think one of the things that PG and Courageous Conversations has lifted up is some of the tools to get there, to do that internal work in a way that's engaged and accountable. One of the last questions I wanted to bring to light from the chat on that note, which I think really speaks a lot to the protocol, is a piece around multiple perspectives and also loss, which is inherent a lot in the kind of adaptive leadership components that show up so much in your work. So we have a question about this idea of truth telling, about sharing our lived experiences. The person said, I get the sense that much of the divide today is that people feel like recognizing others' truth negates their own truth. So Glenn, how do we help people to be with and accept multiple truths or multiple perspectives and multiple people's lived experiences without fearing loss of their own experiences?
Yeah, you're so right, Erica. This is part of the multidisciplinary approach where this adaptive aspect is so important. The fear of loss trumps the fear of change, and so what it means to actually listen to another person's story does not mean to agree. And we can humanize each other in our different stories. And once we've humanized each other, we can add perspective to each other's story. And so what's happening is that, race doesn't really have the multiple truths. Okay, it has multiple interpretations. And so there is either white privilege or there's not. Okay, now, when we arrive at the original conversation of white privilege, and we don't let people actually find their story of race more fully before that, okay, then there's defensiveness. I'm more than, my white privilege or whatever it is, right? And that's true, you are. But if that's the beginning of the conversation, there's nowhere for a white person to go. But if we start with the first tier of the conversation, how we engage, right? And that person develops an insight about race and includes, for example, white as a race, which is not how we're socialized, okay? Then we get to the second level of the conversation where we're talking about these multiple interpretations of the same reality. So we just get used to that. That's pretty normal because race is a social construct. Race is, this invented idea forced on us. And so based on what our experiences are previously, that's how our beliefs are going to be formed. And so when we get to that piece and we start wrestling with, how we listen to where it might be that something's missing in your construct there, then we just start to add that. And at the end of the day, I don't find people divided by race around racial truth. Okay, I find that to happen when we try to get to the most sophisticated part of the conversation without establishing relationship first.
That's right. And I think so much of that relationship, and as you've mentioned, the humanization, the humanizing of Black, Indigenous people of color's lived experiences, narratives, history is.
That's it. When I said to my white college roommate, and it took all the way until probably about 5 or 6 years ago, when he actually decided to read my book and those kinds of things, and he found a part in it that was speaking to him. And I just said, and we're closest of friends, and we're really battling this aspect of society that says that interracial friendships cannot last through a lifetime, because usually they just sort of fall off and whatever happens, right? And I said to him, I said, Keith, here's the challenge. When I tell you about my life, okay, my experience, which I know more than anything else on the planet, you have to stop believing that you can disbelieve me, right? It's not open yet for your interpretation, okay? Just believe me. And so we're in a society right now where the George Floyd video is so shocking to people, because all along the time, the century of policing in this country, people of color have not been believed. And if you will, in a later conversation, that is white supremacy, right? Just the belief that because this is not your experience, and therefore it defines racially, because people of color are not shocked. They're actually just, traumatized, okay, but not shocked that it happened. And so this believing, if people of color were actually awarded the belief of the larger society, then we go so much further. And I think that that's so key in this moment. That's the humanizing aspect. Let me be expert of my experience, and then we can get to a conversation.
Well, I can't think of a more beautiful line of yours to end on. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time, but please let me extend our immense gratitude to you, Glenn, for joining us today. It was so wonderful and much appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thanks for the idea to have me here, and let's keep going. Dr. Muhammad.
Thank you very much, Glenn. That was incredible. And I look forward to learning more from you and about your work. And by the way, the Wyden and Kennedy work, absolutely amazing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Should I